Hi folks, I'm Ken Endelman. I'm with Balanced Body, and I'm here today with Karen Frischman, who has been just a phenomenal help with designing the Contrology line. She's a fountain of information. She is the one person, she's I think probably the best person in terms of converting the practice of Pilates into kind of the technical words and stuff that help our engineers and guys like me understand a lot more. So for that, I'm in her debt.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Karen, for all your help.
Thank you. I'm so excited to talk about the Contrology springs today with you.
So we'll call this episode Fun with Springs?
Fun with Springs.
Fun with Springs, right? So anyway, we get a lot of questions about Contrology springs and what makes them different, why they're different, how they're different, right? And I could try and do that, but with an expert here, why would I do that if I have Karen to do this with me? So I think what we'll do is I'm going to talk a little bit about springs and how they are different, and then Karen's going to talk about the specific things about Contrology springs and really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of all this stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing you have to understand is that a spring is a really complicated thing. What makes springs stronger and weaker is how thick the wire is, how thick the barrels are, right, and how long the spring is, right? And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in between that stuff. So it's how tightly they twist the coils when they actually wind the springs, right? It's how much carbon is in the steel before they actually make the spring, before they make the wire. And then again, it's how much they relieve the heat from that, and it's how they relieve the heat or how they heat treat the springs after the springs are made. All these things have a little bit of determination of how the springs are going to turn out and how they're going to work, and also how long they're going to last. Mm-hmm. So they also make springs out of different materials, but for all purposes for us, we use carbon steel for every one of our springs that we have here because and it's also known as piano wire because we know that it works so well. So Karen, do you want to start by talking about the springs, why they're different, and
Sure. Yeah, and you know, one of the things that's really great about the Contrology springs is that we have historical precedents for a lot of the springs. For all the equipment, we have historical precedents for the way things were, the way they worked. But we know that it feels right in the body. And that, I think, is one of the things that I think is really, really phenomenal about this whole suite of apparatus, but also the springs. So over here we have reformer springs, and Contrology has two different types of reformer springs. We have the Contrology spring, which comes with the Contrology reformers. It has a longer neck and it has a slightly different action. These are the KRN reformer springs, and you can see that they have a shorter neck, and they're going to be very, very similar, but they just have a slightly different feel as you extend on the reformer. Just moving down the line, so over here, our little orphan spring, this is our window chair spring. He doesn't have a nameplate. We have the J-Pack Cadillac leg spring. We have the J-Pack or the heavy arm spring. We have the armchair spring, very sweet, very delicate. We have the heavy pedipole spring, the light pedipole spring. We'll talk about the differences of all these springs as we go through. Rollback bar spring. We have the trap spring and the push-through bar spring. And these, we can talk about how we're going to identify them. Like when you buy your Cadillac, super important. There are tells. We will let you know how all of that happens. We have the light leg spring, and then we have the light arm spring. And I think that's the full complement of springs. So the thing about springs, any spring, and the way that we use them in Pilates is that our springs get heavier as they are extended. They have higher loads of resistance. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the more you stretch your spring out, the more resistance you have. Now, the thing that's completely fascinating about Pilates is that all of the apparatus is based on the student's height. So if I have a student who is 6 foot tall, they're going to be working against a heavier resistance than someone who's 5'1". It's actually built into the nature of the spring. And I think Joe Pilates is really brilliant in how he figured that out.
So if I got a bigger range, then I'm going to take out a spring farther, which is going to be more resistance.
Exactly. It is all built in. Mm-hmm. We don't have to think about it.
There was a handy trick I learned a long time ago.
Okay.
Sometimes when you have two springs that look the same and you can't tell that they're different, if you put them against each other and they slide really easy, you know that they're different. But if they want to lock together, then you know that they're the same.
That's a really handy trick. I did not know that trick. I'm going to have to try that when I get home.
To try that.
All right. So, but you can also tell your springs just by looking at either the wires or by looking at the hooks. So the other thing I want to talk about is we have sort of two different kinds of springs. So we have springs that are like the reformer springs or the chair springs where they have a swivel hook. All right, and then we have springs like the arm springs or the leg springs of the Cadillac where we have a loop hook. Do you want to talk a little bit about the difference in the hooks?
Yeah, I would. So the really cool thing is about these springs, and this is one of the first things I noticed when I looked at reformer springs, is every single reformer spring had a swivel hook on it. And why it's so cool is that when the spring opens up, and this is a chair spring, so it's hard for me to open up, so I can't show you. It wants to twist a little bit, and that's where that boing noise comes from, right? But the really important thing is that when you have this hook on the inside here, there's actually a smaller loop is what's in there, is that it doesn't put any extra load on the coils, which is actually the weakest part of the spring, is where the reduction is and where the hook pulls or where there's a bend in it. So these springs actually are made to last longer than any other spring on the market. I was going to say a lifetime, but you would never want to say a lifetime because everything has a lifetime, right?
Yeah.
But they last a lot longer.
And I'm going to say manufacturer's recommendation for springs, even if they're still in good working order, is about 2 years. You always want to be on the safer side. If you notice rust, if you notice when you extend your spring that there are uneven coils, or if they're sort of off alignment, you want to right. You want to replace them immediately.
Distortions?
Yeah.
Gaps?
Yes.
Right.
Anything that doesn't look like a normal spring, change it.
Just replace
Again, we always want to be safe than sorry. So a couple of things again about this. One is, Ken touched on the fact that the different wires will help to determine the overall resistance or strength of the spring. The number of coils, how tightly or how loosely they're coiled, will change all of that. So each spring is going to have, again, its own formula, its own soup. And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that these hooks on the swivel hooks are actually made of a thicker wire.
Usually, yes.
So that they have more support. Again, this is going to be the weakest part of your spring. Now the other thing is all except for, I believe, one spring in the suite, you're going to notice that each spring is going to have a taper of coils at the end. The tapers are going to be a little bit different. They might be, like a inset and straight, or they might be a taper like this, like a cone shape. And that taper is going to be a stronger group of springs. They're going to extend at a different rate than the barrel, and this is actually going to protect your attachment point. It's going to give it longevity. How do we clean the springs?
The secret is
you don't. All right.
If the springs, these springs are not plated, and so and they do, when you're grabbing them with your hand and stuff, there's stuff in your hands that cause them to rust and stuff. If the rust becomes a problem and it annoys you, it's not really that big of a problem, then the best thing to do is just to wipe the springs down with a clean rag. A clean, dry rag, that's all you need to do. That's probably the best thing for you. Yeah.
Less is more when we come to the springs. And, again, rust is the enemy of a good spring. So depending on where you are, if your studio is in a more humid climate, you're going to need to replace your springs more frequently because they will rust. And I will say, I have to say, in the sort of the grand scheme of springs, reformer springs need to be replaced more often, not only because of air and humidity, but we sweat on them because we're leaning over them, and so the sweat is going to corrode the spring. So again, I recommend maintenance for a really big, busy studio. You need to really be looking at all of your springs and rotating your springs, just like you rotate your tires, probably about every 3 months.
Yeah.
If it's a home studio, you might be able to go a little bit longer, but I always want to make sure that all of my attachments are safe, my springs are in good working order. It's important.
And it's important to have a system for how you rotate your springs. So on a Contrology reformer, they go 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you maybe just keep moving them over. Maybe put 1 into 2 position, 2 into 3 position, 3 in the 4 position, 4 back to 1.
Yep.
3 months later, do the whole thing over again. If you keep doing that, you'll get a much longer and much more satisfactory life out of your springs.
Yeah, one of the things about the Contrology spring specifically and the way that we use the reformer is that the 2 inside springs get 50% more use than the 2 outside springs. I know this because I did a spreadsheet, because that's what I do. But so you want to, again, make sure that you have your springs balanced so that they get even wear as you use them.
Why would you not do that, right?
Right, exactly,
Yes,
exactly. You know, like, why wouldn't you do it? There's no
It's
reason.
the heart of your reformer. It's
It
the
is.
heart of your
Oh, I
equipment.
like that. It is the
Yeah.
heart of your reformer. It is
It
the
is.
heart of Pilates and all,
Yes.
in my opinion.
I think so.
Yeah.
We make 2 different types of reformer springs in the Contrology world. So we do the KRN reformer spring, and then we also have the regular spring that we got from Jay Grimes, right?
Yep.
And the KRN spring, which is
Right here.
which is this one,
It's a short neck. I call it a short neck spring.
right, has a short. Let's see, do it like this. Maybe it has a short neck on it, right? And for comparison purposes, here's the long neck. Oh, that's kind of a good demo, isn't it?
Yep.
So, so the difference is, and this spring is a little bit heavier, and it has just a little bit of a different off ramp when it takes off, because it slides down like this before it goes, and so the start is a little bit different, and it's a kind of instead of a, you know, reformer. Actually, all reformer springs are very linear. They have a very straight line of resistance. This one goes a little bit. There's a little doo-wah in the bottom of it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to have a different. It's going to have a different feel. So there are 2 sets of leg springs. We have the standard leg spring, which is over here. And you can notice when we look sort of like on all the springs that the 2 leg springs are going to be longer and heavier. The standard leg spring is a standard leg spring. It's manageable. Most students are going to be able to use this. I'd say probably all students are going to be able to use this. Jay always ascertained that in the studio when he was there, that they had 2 sets of springs. They had a set of light leg springs and they had a set of heavy leg springs over there. That Jay's pack spring, this is like the sort of the widest, largest barrel of spring, is going to be significantly heavier. It's really great if you are looking to build strength on someone who can manage these springs, but they're not for everybody. I like them. So those are the 2 springs. Now again, I want you to notice the difference in hooks on our arm springs, which are all these smaller guys, and on the leg springs. So instead of having the swivel hook, we have a loop. And the way that these loops are made is they're the last 2 coils and they're just flipped up on end. This is the most vulnerable part of these springs because they're loops and they're continuous. So we have a lot of like significant tapers on all of these springs. And you want to really make sure that you are looking at those loops, because if I'm going to say if a spring is going to fail, either leg springs or arm springs, most likely it's going to be on this loop.
Just you've got your hand on the long spring.
Yes.
And it's a really important point. So I think when people want to know, especially on their trap springs, that there's really no limit as to how far you can pull them.
Right.
But if you want your springs to live and you want them to be safe, a good rule of thumb is to never extend them more than 3 times their solid length. And so if this spring, for instance, is like, say, 20 inches, you don't want to extend it to more than 60 inches. So if you do that, your springs are going to last a long, long time.
Yep.
And it's the same for all these springs. If you don't extend them more than 3 times their solid length, they're going to last a lot longer. And some springs are a little bit more, some are a little bit less, but that's the rule of thumb.
Yeah. Leg springs, arm springs on the Cadillac are always hooked up by a double clip, which we use. And again, if they're moving in and out of those eye bolts, the clips may wear. I'm going to say, for safety's sake, please make sure when you replace your clips that you replace them with the clips that the manufacturer provides. Okay? The clips are load rated and they are they have been tested for the use that we use. The ones that you get in the hardware store, maybe not so much. So call your BB sales rep and get your clips from BB. They do have them.
There's a difference
available.
between a Cadillac and a 15-pound poodle.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. There we go. Okay,
Yes.
that is the quote of the
Yeah,
day. There is
yeah.
a difference between a Cadillac and a 15-pound poodle. Thank
Yes.
you. That's going on my Instagram. Okay, so both are based off of original designs. You know, I think that's one of the things about this line is that there was so much research that went into all aspects of this line to make sure that y'all got as close as you could to the equipment that was in the studio at the end of Joe's life.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really significant thing because there were so many brilliant discoveries along the way about spring weights and tensions and all of that. Let's talk about the arm springs because there are a lot of them, you know, and I think that where people start to get confused is which arm spring goes where and how to identify them. Okay, so one of the things I want you to notice about the arm spring, so this is the light arm spring. We have the J-Pack arm spring over here. We have the rollback bar spring over here, and then we have our two pedipole springs. All right, so we have a heavy pedipole spring that goes on the KSG. The KSG. So we have the heavy pedipole spring that goes on the fancy pedipole, and then we have the light pedipole spring that goes on the Contrology pedipole. Totally stripped down, very simple. And then we have our armchair spring, which is also an arm spring. Now, each of these springs are going to have a different tension, but they're all roughly, except for the armchair spring, really roughly the same length. So when you get your Cadillac, there are ways to identify your arm springs. So the first spring we have is the rollback bar spring, okay? And it's going to have a taper, and it's just like just a little inset, and then the loop is going to have it's two loops, okay? So it's just a straight two loop up. So that is our first spring. Now this goes on the rollback bar. We have our second spring that comes standard with the Cadillac, which is going to be the light arm spring. And the way that we can determine the light arm spring is there's a little twist in the loop. So we have a taper, it's a slightly shorter taper, it's narrower, but there's a twist in the loop, and that's how we tell the difference. Okay? So those two come standard with your Cadillac. So the third spring we're going to have standard for the Cadillac is going to be the heavy arm spring or the J-Pack arm spring. And this is going to have a smaller, these are only three because it's a heavier spring, a 3-loop taper, and it's kind of shorter and fatter. So that's how I can tell the difference of the springs, and there's no twist. When in doubt, if you have a J-Pack spring and an arm spring, just pull it. It's really heavy. You're going to feel the difference the minute you try and open it, and then you'll know. Teachers ask me if there is a lighter spring because the arm springs are, I won't call them aggressive, but they can be really heavy. So I recommend, because it is an arm spring and it is the same length, that if we want a lighter spring, to use the light pedipole spring. It has a lower resistance. It's still supportive, but for some of my older students or some students who are a little bit more deconditioned, this is actually going to be a good choice for them. All right. So, and I would use it for an arm spring. I wouldn't use it. It wouldn't give you enough support for the rollback bar. Nothing terrible will happen, but it just won't support the exercises. So those are those choices. I cannot recommend, you cannot use the armchair spring on the Cadillac because of the delicacy of the spring wire and coil. It's also, you can see, considerably shorter, so it won't really traverse the distance that we need for these exercises. All right? It is its own thing. Lightest spring in the studio. Now, one of the questions I get asked all the time, so we cannot use our reformer springs on other apparatus or other apparatus. However, or other people's apparatus.
Right.
How's that?
Other manufacturers' apparatus.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. The arm springs and the leg springs, however, since they are attached to an eye bolt, we can use these only the arm springs and leg springs, not the push-through bar springs, not the trapeze. I would not recommend either one of those for safety issues. But since we're only connecting to the eye bolts, these can work on other manufacturers' apparatus, or even the BB, the BB Cadillacs. Nothing terrible will happen.
And just the same old caveat that you can overstretch a spring on anything except for a reformer.
Right.
And just 3x is the max, and maybe even with this one, it might even be less.
Yeah, I would say probably less for that. Now, again, if you do make that decision, know that whenever we move things, it's not going to be an apples to apples. We have things like the width of the poles of the Cadillac. Even if we can adjust the height of the eye bolt, it's going to have a slightly different feel. So just know that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Do you have anything else you want to add about the arm springs?
I just want to say that, not that I want to be too quotable today, but there's no free lunch. and if you put different springs on a different machine, then you're going to get a different experience.
Right.
There's always,
exactly.
That's what's going to happen. It's just going to be a different experience.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really astonishing in the process of just the development of the entire Contrology line is being able to see things, the small changes in a different light, like there is no free lunch, but every millimeter of this apparatus was considered by Joseph Pilates, and any kind of small change or adjustment actually has compounding effects on the body. I am in awe of what that man created, because it's stunning.
Yeah.
And props to you guys for bringing it all back to life. Okay, so we have arm springs, we have leg springs. I think the next thing we need to talk about are the push-through bar springs and the trap springs. I think that's all we have left.
I think so. Yeah.
So the push-through bar springs, when you bring your brand new Contrology Cadillac home, they come in a set of 3. So we have 2 push-through bar springs on the bottom, and we have 1 on the top. The 2 springs on the bottom are generally used so that if we do one-sided work, the spring is going to be behind the student, so that if in the exceedingly rare situation that a spring fails or a clip fails, that it's not in front of the face. All right, so that's a safety consideration. And a lot of times people get confused with their trapeze springs and their push-through bar springs. But if you just look at it, you can see that the wire is much thicker and much heavier on our trapeze bar springs than it is on the push-through bar spring. These are the heaviest springs in the studio. All right, so again, you can, I can't even open it. They're really heavy. And they're meant to be that way so that when we're on the trapeze and we bring our entire body weight on the trapeze for the pull-ups, it's not gonna open. We're gonna be fully supported on that. When you hook up, I'm going to say safety again, when you hook up your push-through bar springs, everything has been measured within an inch of its life to make sure that we have the right distance of the push-through bar from the spring. So these are hooked up to the top with quick links, okay, not double clips. Quick links on one end and then the double clip on the other if we're coming from the top. And then from the bottom, they are hooked in directly to the eye bolts.
Right.
Everything is measured, and you should clip it with your double hook from the bottom. Everything is measured, everything is the same. These cannot be used on other manufacturers' equipment, because all of the measurements, the heights of the push-through bar, all of those things come into consideration in how these springs perform, but also in how we can use them safely.
So the other question we had to ask is, what's the difference between balanced body springs and Contrology springs?
They are, even though they're all springs, they have different characteristics within the spring. So in Contrology, and I'm going to say with the reformer spring specifically, we have no color coding. We just have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So when we take one spring off, we have 25% less. All of our technique is based off of that equation, and the loads are appropriate and all of that kind of stuff. So I think technique and apparatus grow together. And I think it's really important to understand that. And it's not the feel of the reformer or the way that it functions really goes beyond springs. So it's about the combination of wheel and rail and how the drag and how they perform. It's about the weight of the carriage. It's about the, like all of those components, for a reason, like a seemingly simple machine. There's a lot of engineering. There's a lot of physics that go into it. So that's one thing. I think if you were on a balanced body reformer and you wanted to get a little bit closer to the feel, again, it's not going to be the same of a Contrology, it would be Red Springs.
It would be the Red Springs, yeah.
And I think that, again, technique and apparatus go hand in hand, but having the half spring on the balanced body is really lovely. It just gives you more choices. And again, it's just a different way. It's just a different way of approaching the work. So there's that. And I feel like the Cadillac springs, and this is a highly technical term, are a little bouncier. They feel a little bit more buoyant. So the pull on these springs is a very linear pull. It's a very little linear feel. And I think and this is just my opinion, it's not scientific at all, but they have a little bit of a softer feel. The other big difference is that the balanced body springs are coated. All right, so they are shiny and they are plated. You want to talk a little bit about that in the process?
I will, and it's a little controversial, but I'll mention it anyway.
Okay.
So the balanced body springs are all plated, and we use an electroless nickel coating on the plating. So, and we use electroless nickel because there's no hydrogen embrittlement. So sometimes in the plating process, and this is true for a long time before they had electroless nickel plating, you would have this process called hydrogen embrittlement, and that would get into the little pores and fissures in the metal and expand and cause corrosion and could cause the spring to break. Mm-hmm. So it's it would prevent corrosion, but it could also exacerbate little micro fractures in the metal. Mm-hmm. So the process we use is electroless nickel, and that does not exacerbate these little fractures that I'm talking about, and then it also prevents corrosion. So that's why we use it. Mm-hmm. Supposedly, it makes no difference in terms of how long the spring lasts, but there is some heat involved in the electroless nickel process, and that might have something to do with how the springs react. Mm-hmm. There's so much going on when they make a spring that, and there's so many variables that they have to measure and protect against. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's really the difference between a high quality spring manufacturer and one that's not. Mm-hmm. These springs, the Contrology springs and the balanced body springs, are made to really exacting requirements. Mm-hmm. Exacting, 25 years ago was like, well, you get it within 10% either direction, then you're good enough, right? That's considered to be a good spring. Mm-hmm. Most manufacturers still hold it at 10%, give or take, right? Our manufacturers, it's a lot tighter. It's about 25% better than that. And really what makes the springs better is that the fact that they can measure and keep tolerances in a way that they could never keep them before. So they know exactly how much carbon is in the wire. They know exactly how much preload they put on the wire when they start to twist it. They know exactly what the feed rates are going to be. They know exactly where the spring's going to be when it gets heat treated in the oven. So you could imagine being on the outside, it gets more heat. On the inside, it gets less heat. But if it's the right kind of oven and the temperature's controlled, then all the springs get the same amount of heat, which means they get the same amount of relief to them. Mm-hmm. So there's that, and there's a lot of other things too, that they can just measure these tolerances, and they can keep the tolerances much better now, and that gives you a much more uniform product. Yep. And that's the difference between the springs made now and the springs made 50 years ago, or even springs from other manufacturers. Yeah, and that's exactly it, which is that, there will always be sort of a little bit of latitude, a little bit of margin mm-hmm. within springs. So you may feel like you have a set of reformer springs that might be a little bit heavier or a little bit lighter, but because the tolerances are within,
what, 8%, 8.5%.
Yeah.
It's really like consistent. You can trust consistently that you will get a matched set of springs and that they will be really almost imperceptibly different. And I think that that's huge. And I think that quality control and that specificity with the
specificity.
Yeah, okay, I don't know what that word is. but,
specificity,
but,
yes.
but being able to have a spring manufacturer that can give you that narrow tolerance makes it a better product.
Yeah. You know, we have different testing processes for just about every part that comes in here, right? So if we have, for instance, a supplier that we don't trust that much, we'll check 100% of the parts that come in here to make sure that every single one meets our standard, right? Mm-hmm. We have processes to protect ourselves against, like if we get a bad shipment, for instance. So like somebody like the paint's bad or something like that, we have insurance stock on the shelf so that we don't have to stop making stuff, which works really good except for during COVID. Okay, so, but generally what happens is you know, different suppliers have different, I don't know the name for it, but we check their stuff more consistently than others. So like for instance, if we have, with our spring companies, we know that they're very consistent. So we might check 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 springs, right? If for some reason we see any kind of anomaly, we'll automatically go to 1 in 5 or 1 or 1 in 2 or even every single one. Mm-hmm. But that's how we check it. And then when we check it, we also, not only do we look at it visually, right? Mm-hmm. So like for instance, like if there happened to be some rust on it or something like that, we would reject that because rust on a new spring is not acceptable, right? Mm-hmm. We then have testers that we put the springs on. So like for instance, a new design, or if we see if there's anything fishy at all about the spring, we actually have a testing machine that just pulls on the spring and releases, pulls and releases, pulls and releases. It's a pneumatic machine and it does this, you know, day after day after day. We're testing springs right now, and that machine, it's been running, it's got like 300,000 cycles on it right now. To make sure that the springs hold up. So we do that kind of a testing. Mm-hmm. And then we also have a digital machine where we can stretch the spring, and at different places we can check the resistance. So if for instance a spring at 16 inches is supposed to be 20 pounds, if it's 21 pounds then it's going to be okay, but if it's 22 pounds it's probably not going to be okay, right? So those are the things that we look for when we're testing the springs, and that's done periodically, you know.
That's great.
Unless we find an anomaly, then we change it. But that's true with just about everything that we do here. And so it just makes sure that when the springs go out, we know that they're good.
That's great. That's great. Why are the Contrology springs the best on the market?
I love that question. Yes. It's because we took these springs that we got from Jay, and we measured every single thing that we could possibly think about measuring them, and looked at every single like little detail, including like how long is this reduction on the neck, right? How is the spring? How's the hook made, right? Then we tested the resistance, and we copied, and we checked it all different lengths to see exactly where it fell, right? And so then we went to our spring company, which is a whatever the latest ISO certification is. ISO 9000 something, I forget what it is, but and then we give it to them with this how we want the spring to look and how we want the spring to perform, right? And then what happens is then they make samples of these springs that they think are going to meet our specifications, and then we measure them, right? And maybe it's right, maybe it's not. But usually the first time it's not right? So there's a bunch of iterations to get the right spring. And we start with a small lot, usually 500 springs. Then once we find out that we're really going to get some consistency, then we go to larger lots. And then we do the periodic inspections that I was talking about. But really, when you talk about, so starting with a really good set of specifications based on what you think is a really excellent sample, and having J Springs was a really great sample. Yeah. And then manufacturing them in a really controlled environment where the tolerances are so tight, right? Is how you get a really good spring and how you get that consistency. Yeah. And that's really what our goal is to make a spring that's as good as it can be, and really better than it was 50 years ago. And these springs are better because they just are made to higher standards.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're amazing. I wanted to add one story. You can confirm this. Okay. But I remember when we were looking at the J-Pack springs, these arm springs. So these were built off of a set of springs that Clara gave Jay. And I remember when you guys were testing it and this and all the tolerances that the spring manufacturer said it was an impossible spring. And so there was a lot of conversation about the fact that, well, no, we have actually the spring, it's not impossible, but that you guys really worked with the spring, closely with the spring manufacturer to bring this spring into all of its original tolerances and length and resistance. So, so kudos to you.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is it got down to a guy that was an old guy that actually knew how these springs were made back in those days, and was able to reproduce that.
Right, and
process.
that, and again, like that level of that attention to detail, that level of pursuit to get it right, is what makes not only the springs but the entire Contrology line the best.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So this is Ken Endelman from BB Garage. This is Karen Frischman, who's been a phenomenal guest.
Thank you.
Probably. I was your assistant today, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, I got to be Karen's assistant today. For more tips and help on what you can do with your equipment, go to Pilates.com/BB Garage, and you'll find more information there about Contrology reformers and everything else that we do at Balanced Body. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for joining.